Hello, everyone. Today we have some crazy Reddit stories from people who really decided to air out their business online. So, grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. Perfect if you're doing other stuff or just want something in the background. All right, time for our first story. And this one's called My Aunt Secretly Changed My Wedding Venue Without Telling Me, So Guests Showed Up at the Wrong Place. So, this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still processing the absolute chaos my aunt caused at what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. My fiance Jake and I had been planning our wedding for over a year, and everything was finally coming together perfectly. My Aunt Carol has always been involved in family events. She's my mom's younger sister and has this thing where she thinks she knows better than everyone else about everything. When I was growing up, she'd constantly insert herself into situations that had nothing to do with her. She'd show up to my school events uninvited, give my parents unsolicited parenting advice, and always had opinions about every decision our family made. When Jake and I got engaged, Carol immediately started offering to help with the wedding planning. At first, I was grateful because weddings are expensive and stressful, and she seemed genuinely excited to be involved. She kept saying things like, "I just want this to be perfect for you, sweetie," and "Let me take some of the burden off your shoulders." The venue we chose was this beautiful outdoor garden space about 30 minutes outside the city. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was exactly what Jake and I wanted. We'd had our engagement photos taken there, and it held special meaning for us because that's where Jake first told me he loved me during a hiking trip 2 years earlier. Carol kept making comments about the venue, though. She'd say things like, "Are you sure it's not too far for people to drive?" And, "What if it rains?" And, "Don't you think somewhere more traditional would be better?" I brushed off her concerns because honestly, every bride deals with people having opinions about their choices. About 2 months before the wedding, Carol offered to help coordinate with vendors and handle some of the final details. She said she had experience from planning her daughter's wedding 5 years ago and insisted she could save me time and stress. My mom encouraged me to let her help because I was working full-time and Jake was in his final semester of grad school. We were both stretched pretty thin. I gave Carol a list of vendor contacts and asked her to confirm final details, like delivery times and setup requirements. She seemed thrilled to be given this responsibility and kept telling everyone how honored she was that I trusted her with such important tasks. The first red flag should have been when she started asking really specific questions about the venue contract. She wanted to know about cancellation policies, whether we could change locations, what the penalties would be for making modifications. I thought she was just being thorough and trying to understand all the moving pieces. Then, about 3 weeks before the wedding, she suggested we should have a backup indoor location just in case of bad weather. She'd researched some options and found this banquet hall that she thought would be much more appropriate for a formal wedding. I told her we were fine with our original plan and that the garden venue had covered pavilion areas in case of rain. She kept pushing, though. She'd send me links to photos of indoor weddings and talk about how much more elegant they looked. She started making comments to other family members about how she was worried about our venue choice and hoped everything would work out okay. My mom started getting anxious about it too, because Carol kept planting seeds of doubt. 2 weeks before the wedding, Carol called me and said she'd taken the liberty of putting a hold on the banquet hall she liked, just as a backup option. She said it would only cost a small deposit and we could cancel it if we didn't need it. I was annoyed, but didn't want to cause drama so close to the wedding date. I told her to cancel the backup venue because we weren't changing our plans. She said she understood and would take care of it right away. I should have followed up to make sure she actually canceled it, but I was dealing with a million other wedding details and trusted that she'd respect my wishes. The week of the wedding, I was getting my final headcount together and confirming details with all our vendors. Everything seemed to be on track. Carol had been checking in regularly and seemed helpful and supportive. She kept saying how excited she was for the big day and how beautiful everything was going to be. The night before the wedding, we had our rehearsal dinner at a restaurant near our hotel. Carol was there with the rest of the family and seemed perfectly normal. She gave a sweet speech about how happy she was for Jake and me and how she couldn't wait to see us get married. Nothing seemed off at all. The morning of the wedding, I was getting ready with my bridesmaids at the hotel. Everything was going smoothly until about 2 hours before the ceremony, when my phone started blowing up with confused calls and texts from guests. The first call was from my college roommate Sarah, asking why the address she had didn't match what her GPS was showing. Then my coworker called, saying she'd driven to the location but couldn't find any signs of a wedding setup. More and more guests started calling and texting, saying they were lost or couldn't find the venue. I was completely panicked and confused. I kept giving people the correct address and assuming they were just having GPS issues or had written it down wrong. But when my own grandmother called, saying she was standing in an empty field, I knew something was seriously wrong. Jake was dealing with the same thing on his side. His best man was frantically trying to coordinate with confused guests while Jake was getting dressed. We were both starting to panic that somehow our vendors had screwed up, or that there was some miscommunication about the location. Then I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was from Carol, and she sounded way too calm for someone dealing with a wedding emergency. She said, "Sweetie, I have some good news. I was able to fix the venue situation. Everyone's been redirected to the beautiful banquet hall I told you about. It's all set up and ready to go." I literally couldn't speak for a moment. I asked her what she meant by redirected, and she explained that she'd contacted our entire guest list the week before and given them the address for the banquet hall instead of our original venue. She told them there had been a last-minute change due to weather concerns, and that they should go to the new location. She'd also contacted all of our vendors and had them deliver everything to the banquet hall. The flowers, the catering, the DJ, the photographer, everything had been moved to this completely different venue that Jake and I had never even seen. I was screaming at this point. I asked her how she could possibly think it was okay to change our entire wedding without telling us. She got defensive and said she was just trying to help and that she knew we'd be happier with a proper venue. She said the banquet hall was much more elegant and that our families would be more comfortable there. She kept saying, "You'll thank me later," and "Trust me, this is so much better," like she'd done us some huge favor instead of completely sabotaging our wedding day. She couldn't understand why I was upset and kept insisting that she'd only made the change because she loved us and wanted our day to be perfect. Meanwhile, Jake and I were supposed to be leaving for our ceremony in 30 minutes and had to figure out how to salvage this disaster. Half our guests were at the wrong location. Our vendors were set up somewhere we'd never been, and we had no idea what this banquet hall even looked like. We had to make the horrible decision to go along with Carol's plan because there was literally no time to fix anything. Our photographer was already at the banquet hall, our food was being prepared there, and most of our guests had already arrived at the new location. The banquet hall was fine, but it wasn't us at all. It was this generic, beige event space with fluorescent lighting and no personality. Nothing like the romantic garden setting we dreamed of. Our carefully planned decorations looked completely wrong in this space, and the whole vibe was totally different from what we'd envisioned. But the worst part was watching Carol act like she'd saved the day. She was greeting guests and accepting compliments on the venue like she was the bride. She kept telling people how she'd stepped in at the last minute to make sure everything was perfect, and how the kids are so lucky to have someone looking out for them. I confronted her again during the reception, and she still didn't understand why I was angry. She said I was being ungrateful, and that someday I'd realize she'd done the right thing. She started crying, and saying that she'd worked so hard to make our day special, and that I was hurting her feelings by not appreciating her efforts. Other family members started taking her side because they could see she was upset and didn't understand the full situation. They thought I was being a bridezilla for yelling at her on my wedding day. She played the victim perfectly, acting like I was attacking her for trying to help. The whole thing cast this shadow over what should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead of enjoying my wedding, I spent the entire day angry and feeling like I'd been robbed of the ceremony Jake and I had actually wanted. We couldn't even get photos at our original venue because everything was already set up at the banquet hall. After the wedding, Carol continued to act like she'd done nothing wrong. She'd tell people about how she'd saved our wedding and how grateful we were for her help. When family members would bring up what happened, she'd twist the story to make it sound like we'd been planning to change venues all along, and she'd just helped coordinate the logistics. Jake and I decided we needed to go no contact with her for a while. We sent her a letter explaining how hurt and violated we felt by her actions. We told her that changing our wedding without our permission was a massive betrayal of trust, and that her refusal to acknowledge the harm she'd caused made it impossible for us to have a relationship with her. She responded by sending a long email to our entire extended family, painting herself as the victim of ungrateful relatives. She said she'd gone out of her way to help us and that we'd turned on her for no reason. She claimed we were cutting her out of our lives because we couldn't handle having someone in the family who cared enough to speak up when we were making mistakes. Most of our family bought her version of events because she's always been manipulative and good at playing victim. My mom was caught in the middle and kept trying to get us to reconcile because family is family, and Carol was just trying to help. It's been 6 months now, and we're still not speaking to Carol. Jake and I are in therapy, trying to process the trauma of having our wedding hijacked and dealing with the family fallout. We're planning to renew our vows next year at the venue we originally wanted, just for us and maybe a few close friends who understand what really happened. The hardest part is that Carol genuinely seems to believe she did the right thing. She's never once apologized or acknowledged that she overstepped. In her mind, she saved our wedding from being a disaster, and we're just too stubborn to admit she was right. This story makes me absolutely livid. What Carol did wasn't just boundary stomping. It was straight up sabotage disguised as help. She literally hijacked someone's wedding day and then had the audacity to play victim when they were upset about it. This is classic narcissistic behavior. She decided she knew better than the actual bride and groom about their own wedding, made massive changes without consent, and then couldn't understand why they weren't grateful. The fact that she's still telling people she saved their wedding shows she has zero accountability or self-awareness. Family doesn't give you the right to make major life decisions for other adults. The couple is completely justified in going no contact, and anyone defending Carol's actions is enabling manipulation. Let's move on to the next story here. And this one's called, "My Brother Sold Our Childhood Home Behind My Back and Acted Like I Should Thank Him." This happened about 8 months ago, and I'm still dealing with the legal mess my brother created. Our parents passed away within 2 years of each other. Dad from a heart attack 3 years ago, and Mom from cancer last year. They left us their house, which had been in our family for over 30 years. My brother Derek has always been the type who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Growing up, he was the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was constantly criticized for not being more like him. He went to business school, got some corporate job, and never let anyone forget how successful he was compared to the rest of us. When our parents got sick, Derek lived across the country and visited maybe twice a year. I was the one who moved back home to take care of them, helped with doctor appointments, managed their medications, and basically put my life on hold for 2 years. Derek would call occasionally and send money, but he wasn't there for the day-to-day reality of watching our parents decline. After Mom passed, we had to figure out what to do with the house. It's this beautiful old Victorian that my parents bought when Derek and I were little kids. Every room has memories. The kitchen where Mom taught me to bake, the living room where we opened Christmas presents, my old bedroom that still had some of my high school posters on the walls. The house needed some work, but it was structurally sound and in a good neighborhood. I suggested we fix it up and either rent it out for income or one of us could move back in eventually. Derek immediately started talking about how we should sell it as quickly as possible and split the money. I wasn't ready to let go of the house yet. It felt like losing our parents all over again. Plus, I'd been living there as their caregiver, and it was still my home in a lot of ways. I asked Derek if we could wait at least 6 months before making any big decisions, just to give ourselves time to grieve and think clearly. He agreed, or at least I thought he did. He said he understood that I needed more time and that there was no rush to do anything. We decided to split the property taxes and maintenance costs while we figured things out. For the next few months, I was the only one actually taking care of the house. I was paying for utilities, doing yard work, handling repairs when things broke, and basically treating it like my responsibility. Derek never sent money for any of the expenses we'd agreed to split, but whenever I brought it up, he'd say he was having cash flow issues at work and would catch up later. Around month 4, Derek started bringing up selling again. He'd call and talk about how much money we were losing by not putting the house on the market. He'd send me real estate listings showing what similar houses in the area had sold for and calculating how much we could each make if we sold immediately. I told him I still wasn't ready and that we'd agreed to wait at least 6 months. He seemed frustrated but said he respected my feelings and would continue to be patient. He started talking about how he understood the house had sentimental value and that he didn't want to pressure me into anything I wasn't comfortable with. But then he began making comments about how I was being emotional instead of practical. He'd say things like, "I know this is hard, but we need to think with our heads, not our hearts. And Mom and Dad would want us to be smart about this financially." He started framing my reluctance to sell as me being irrational or immature. He also started questioning whether I could really afford to keep up with my share of the house expenses. He'd point out that I'd been out of work while caring for our parents and ask if I was sure I could handle the financial responsibility long term. It felt like he was trying to make me doubt myself and my decision. About 5 months after Mom died, Derek said he wanted to come visit and see the house. I was actually excited because I thought maybe spending time there would help him understand why I wasn't ready to sell. I planned to show him some of Mom and Dad's things I'd been going through, and maybe we could make decisions together about what to keep. He came for a weekend and seemed really interested in going through the house room by room. He was asking lots of questions about the condition of different things, taking photos, and even measuring some of the rooms. I thought he was just being thorough, or maybe getting sentimental about the memories. But then I noticed he was also asking weird questions about paperwork. He wanted to know where Mom had kept important documents, whether I'd found the deed to the house, stuff about insurance policies. He said he was just trying to make sure we had everything organized, in case we needed it later. The weekend seemed to go well. We looked through photo albums, shared stories about our childhood, and Derek seemed to understand better why the house meant so much to me. When he left, he hugged me and said he was glad we were taking our time with everything and not rushing into any decisions. 2 weeks later, I got a call that turned my world upside down. It was from a real estate agent, asking when I could schedule a time for her to come take photos of the house for the listing. I told her she had the wrong number because our house wasn't for sale. She seemed confused and said she'd been hired by Derek to handle the sale. She had a signed contract and everything. She said Derek had told her I was aware of the listing and that we were co-owners who had agreed to sell. I hung up and immediately called Derek. He didn't answer his phone, so I kept calling until he finally picked up. I asked him what the hell was going on and why a real estate agent was calling me about selling the house. He got defensive immediately and started talking about how he'd been thinking about our conversation during his visit and decided it was time to move forward. He said he'd found a great agent and that we needed to strike while the market was hot. I reminded him that we'd agreed to wait and that I wasn't ready to sell. He said that was months ago and that I'd had enough time to get used to the idea. He acted like my feelings about keeping the house were just a phase I needed to get over. Then he dropped the bombshell. He told me he'd already signed a listing agreement and that the house was going on the market the following week. He said he had every right to do this as a 50% owner and that I couldn't stop him even if I wanted to. I was screaming at this point. I couldn't believe he'd gone behind my back and made this massive decision without consulting me. He kept talking over me, saying I was being hysterical and that I'd thank him later when we both had money in the bank instead of a house we couldn't afford to maintain. He said he'd done all the research and found the best agent in the area. He'd negotiated a great commission rate and timed the listing perfectly for the spring market. He talked about it like he'd done me this huge favor by handling all the details while I was too emotional to think straight. The worst part was when he started lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. He said that as the older brother, he felt obligated to make the smart financial decision, even if I was too sentimental to see the bigger picture. He actually used the phrase tough love like he was parenting a child instead of making a major decision about jointly owned property. I told him he couldn't just sell the house without my agreement, but he said he'd already talked to a lawyer and that either owner could force a sale if the other one was being unreasonable. He'd apparently been planning this for weeks and had all his legal ducks in a row. The house went on the market 3 days later. I came home from work to find a realtor's sign in the front yard and strangers walking around taking photos. The listing described it as a motivated seller situation and priced it to move quickly. I tried to fight it legally, but Derek was right that he could force a sale as a co-owner. My lawyer said I could drag it out in court for months, but it would be expensive and I'd probably lose anyway. The best I could do was try to influence the asking price and terms. Derek handled all the negotiations and showings without consulting me about anything. He accepted the first decent offer that came in, even though I thought we could have gotten more money if we'd waited for the right buyer. He was in such a rush to close that he agreed to a below-market price just to get it done quickly. Throughout the whole process, he acted like I should be grateful for everything he was doing. He'd call with updates and expect me to be excited about offers and closing dates. When I was upset or unresponsive, he'd get frustrated and say I was making this harder than it needed to be. The house sold 6 weeks after it was listed. Derek handled all the paperwork and closing details, then sent me a check for my half of the proceeds minus expenses he'd decided to deduct. He'd taken out money for realtor fees, legal costs, and even reimbursement for his travel expenses when he'd visited. After everything was finalized, he called me to congratulate us on the successful sale. He said he was proud of how well everything had worked out and that we'd both be better off financially now that we weren't tied down by property we didn't need. He kept talking about what a smart investment move this had been and how much money we'd saved by not having to do major repairs or deal with property management. He seemed genuinely confused when I wasn't celebrating with him. When I told him I felt betrayed and manipulated, he got angry and said I was being ungrateful. He said he'd taken care of everything while I was paralyzed by grief and indecision. He claimed I should be thanking him for having the courage to make the hard decisions when I couldn't. He started listing all the work he'd done, finding the agent, negotiating terms, handling paperwork, coordinating the closing. He talked about it like he'd done me this enormous favor by taking control of the situation and getting results. The conversation ended with him saying that someday I'd realize he'd done the right thing, and that I'd appreciate having the money instead of being stuck with a house I couldn't afford. He said that as my older brother, sometimes he had to make decisions I didn't like for my own good. It's been 8 months since the sale, and Derek still doesn't understand why I'm angry with him. He sends me texts occasionally with articles about the real estate market, showing how prices have gone up since we sold, like he's proving what a genius he was for timing it perfectly. He's told other family members that I'm holding a grudge over a smart business decision and that I'm being emotional instead of rational. He's painted himself as the responsible one who had to step up and make tough choices while his sister was too sentimental to do what needed to be done. We haven't spoken since the closing. I can't forgive him for taking away my childhood home and acting like he did me a favor. That house was the last connection I had to our parents, and he sold it out from under me like it was just another investment property. The money is sitting in my savings account because I can't bring myself to spend it. Every time I look at that balance, all I see is the house that should still be in our family and the brother who chose profit over preserving our parents' legacy. This is such a massive betrayal of trust, I can barely process it. Derek didn't just sell a house. He destroyed his sister's last connection to their parents and then had the nerve to act like she should thank him for it. This is classic manipulative behavior disguised as looking out for someone's best interests. He ignored her clearly stated wishes, went behind her back to make irreversible decisions, then gaslighted her into thinking she was being irrational for wanting time to grieve. The fact that he's still sending her real estate articles shows he has zero understanding of what he actually took from her. Family doesn't give you the right to make major life decisions for other adults, especially when they've explicitly asked you to wait. She's completely justified in cutting him off, and he deserves every bit of anger he's getting. All right, moving on to the next story. And this one's called, I Found Out My Girlfriend Was Engaged to Someone Else the Entire Time We Were Dating. This happened about a year ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around how someone could be this deceptive for so long. I met Sarah at a coffee shop near my office where I'd go to work on my laptop during lunch breaks. She was always there around the same time, and we started making small talk about books we were reading and work stuff. After about 2 weeks of casual conversations, I finally asked her out. She seemed genuinely excited and said she'd been hoping I would ask. We went to dinner that Friday night and had this amazing connection. She was funny, smart, and we talked for hours about everything from travel dreams to childhood memories. Sarah told me she worked in marketing for a healthcare company and lived in an apartment about 20 minutes from downtown. She seemed really interested in my job as a graphic designer and asked tons of questions about my projects and clients. Everything felt natural and easy between us. We started dating regularly after that first date. She was always available for weekend plans and would text me throughout the day. She seemed genuinely invested in getting to know me and building something real together. I felt like I'd finally met someone who was on the same page about wanting a serious relationship. The only thing that seemed slightly off was that she was always the one to suggest what we should do and where we should go. She preferred staying in or going to restaurants and movies in my neighborhood, rather than exploring places near where she lived. When I suggested checking out bars or events closer to her apartment, she'd always have some reason why we should stick to areas I was familiar with. She also never invited me to her place. After about 6 weeks of dating, I started bringing up the fact that we always hung out at my apartment. She said her roommate was going through a messy breakup, and the situation at home was really tense. She claimed she preferred the peace and quiet of my place, and liked having space away from all that drama. I understood wanting to avoid roommate issues, so I didn't push it. Plus, I liked having her at my apartment, and she seemed comfortable there. She'd leave clothes in my dresser and kept some of her stuff in my bathroom. It felt like we were naturally moving towards something more serious. Around the 2-month mark, Sarah started being less available on weekends. She'd say she had family obligations or work events that came up last minute. She was still texting me constantly during the week, and we'd see each other for dinner dates, but our weekend time together got more limited. When I asked about it, she said her sister was going through some health issues and needed a lot of support. She felt bad for not being available as much, but said her family had to come first during this difficult time. I respected that and tried to be understanding about the scheduling challenges. But then I started noticing she was really vague about the details of these family situations. When I'd ask how her sister was doing, or if there was anything I could do to help, Sarah would give these generic responses about it being day by day and that she appreciated my support, but it was something her family needed to handle privately. She also started being weird about her phone. She used to answer texts and calls around me without any issues, but suddenly she'd step into another room to take calls or would flip her phone face down when we were together. When I joked about her being secretive, she said work had been crazy and her boss was calling at all hours about some big project. The red flags were adding up, but I really cared about Sarah and wanted to believe her explanations. She was still affectionate and seemed happy when we were together. She'd talk about future plans like trips we could take or events she wanted us to go to together. It felt like she was as invested in the relationship as I was. About 3 months into dating, Sarah mentioned that she might need to travel for work more frequently. She said her company was expanding into new markets, and she'd been selected for a team that would be visiting potential clients in other cities. She seemed excited about the career opportunity but worried about how it would affect our relationship. I was supportive and told her I wanted her to pursue opportunities that were good for her career. We talked about how we could make it work with her traveling and that I'd be happy to visit her in whatever city she ended up working from. She seemed relieved that I was being so understanding about the situation. The first business trip was supposed to be for 4 days. Sarah texted me when she landed and sent photos of her hotel in the city. But then her communication got really sporadic. She'd go hours without responding to texts and would give short answers when she finally did reply. When I called her on the second night, she sounded distracted and said she was in client dinners that were running really late. She promised to call me the next day when things were less hectic. But she never called, and when I texted asking if everything was okay, she said the meetings were going longer than expected and she'd be home a day later than planned. This pattern continued with her other work trips. She'd be communicative at first, then would basically disappear for days at a time. When she got back, she'd be apologetic and say work had been insane but that she'd missed me and wanted to make up for lost time. I started feeling like something was really wrong, but Sarah would be so loving and attentive when she was back that I'd convince myself I was being paranoid. She'd plan special dates and talk about how much she appreciated my patience with her crazy work schedule. The breaking point came about 5 months into our relationship. Sarah was supposed to be on another business trip, this time for a full week. She'd been texting me sporadically as usual, but on the 3rd day, I didn't hear from her at all. I was worried something had happened to her, so I called her work number that she'd given me for emergencies. The receptionist transferred me to Sarah's department, and when I asked to speak with her, the woman said Sarah was in the office and transferred me to her desk. Sarah picked up the phone sounding completely normal, like she was just having a regular workday. I asked her why she wasn't on the business trip she'd told me about, and there was this long silence before she started stammering about how the trip had been canceled at the last minute and she'd forgotten to tell me. I knew she was lying, but I didn't want to accuse her over the phone. I told her I'd been worried when I couldn't reach her, and asked if we could talk that evening when she got home. She agreed and said she'd come over after work to explain everything. But Sarah never showed up that night. She texted around 9 p.m. saying something urgent had come up with her sister and she needed to handle a family emergency. She said she'd explain everything the next day and that she was sorry for being so scattered lately. I barely slept that night because I knew something was seriously wrong. The next morning, I decided I needed to figure out what was really going on. I'd never been the type to snoop or investigate a partner, but the lies were getting too obvious to ignore. I remembered Sarah had mentioned the name of her apartment complex once, so I decided to drive over there and see if I could figure out what was happening. I felt crazy for doing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was living some kind of double life. When I got to the complex, I didn't really have a plan. I was just hoping maybe I'd see her car or figure out which building she lived in. But as I was walking around looking for apartment numbers, I heard someone call her name. I turned around and saw Sarah walking toward the parking lot with a man I'd never seen before. They were holding hands, and he had his arm around her waist. They looked completely comfortable together, like they'd been together for years. I ducked behind a car so they wouldn't see me and watched them get into his truck together. Sarah was laughing at something he'd said and looked happier and more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. They kissed before he started the engine, and it wasn't a casual peck. It was the kind of kiss you give someone you're deeply in love with. I followed them at a distance, feeling like I was losing my mind. They drove to a brunch place about 10 minutes away and went inside together. I sat in my car in the parking lot trying to process what I'd just witnessed. After about an hour, they came out of the restaurant and got back in his truck. This time, I followed them to a jewelry store. I watched through the window as they looked at rings together, and the man got down on one knee right there in the store. Sarah said yes, and they were both crying happy tears as he put a ring on her finger. The store employees were congratulating them and taking photos. It was clearly a planned proposal, not some spontaneous moment. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to understand how the woman I'd been dating for 5 months was getting engaged to someone else. None of it made sense. How had she been living two completely separate lives, without either of us knowing about the other? I drove home in a complete daze and waited for Sarah to contact me. I knew she would eventually because we had plans that weekend and she'd have to make up some story about where she'd been. I wanted to see what lies she'd come up with before I confronted her with what I'd seen. Sure enough, she texted me that afternoon saying her sister was feeling better and asking if I wanted to grab dinner. She was acting completely normal, like nothing had changed. I told her to come over and that I'd cook something for us. When Sarah showed up at my apartment that evening, she was wearing the engagement ring. She had it turned around so the stone was facing her palm, but I could see the band. She hugged me hello and started chatting about her day like everything was perfectly normal. I let her talk for a few minutes before I asked her directly about the ring. She looked down at her hand and her face went completely white. She started stammering about how it was her grandmother's ring that she'd been getting resized and that she'd forgotten she was wearing it. I told her I'd seen her get engaged that morning at the jewelry store. I described the man she was with and the restaurant they'd gone to. She just stared at me with this look of complete panic, like a trapped animal trying to figure out how to escape. Finally, she broke down and admitted that she'd been engaged to her longtime boyfriend, Mark, for over a year. They'd been together for 4 years and living together the entire time I thought I was dating her. The apartment complex I'd followed her to wasn't even where she lived. That was Mark's friend's place where she'd been meeting me to maintain the lie. She said she'd been planning to break up with me, but had gotten in too deep to figure out how to end it cleanly. She claimed she'd developed real feelings for me, but was too scared to leave Mark because they had this whole life built together. She'd convinced herself she could figure out a way to make everything work without anyone getting hurt. I asked her about all the business trips and family emergencies, and she admitted those were all lies to spend time with Mark. When she said she was traveling for work, she was actually just going home to her real life. The family drama with her sister was completely made up to explain why she wasn't available on weekends when Mark was expecting her to be there. The most devastating part was when she said that Mark had been planning to propose for months and she couldn't figure out how to stop it without explaining why. She said she'd been hoping I would end things with her so she wouldn't have to choose between us. She kept apologizing and saying she'd never meant for things to go so far. She claimed she'd gotten trapped in her lies and didn't know how to get out of them. She said she cared about me, and that part of her relationship with me had been real, even though the circumstances weren't. I told her she needed to leave and that I never wanted to see her again. She tried to argue that we could work through this and that she was willing to break up with Mark to be with me, but I couldn't trust anything she said anymore. If she could lie about something as fundamental as being engaged to someone else, there was no way to believe any of it had been real. Sarah left that night and I blocked her on everything. I found out later through mutual friends that she'd gotten married to Mark 3 months later. Apparently, she'd never told him about me either, so he had no idea his fiancée had been living a double life for 5 months. This story makes me absolutely livid. Leading someone on for 5 months while being engaged to someone else is beyond cruel. It's sociopathic behavior disguised as relationship confusion. Sarah didn't just cheat. She constructed an elaborate fantasy life with fake business trips, fake family emergencies, and fake future plans. The fact that she was planning her wedding while telling another man she loved him shows a level of manipulation that's genuinely disturbing. No decent person does this to someone they claim to care about. He dodged a massive bullet by finding out before he got even deeper into this nightmare. Anyone capable of this level of deception isn't capable of real love or loyalty. Okay, up next, the story we have is called My Best Friend Slept with My Husband in My Own Bed While I Was at Work. This happened 6 months ago, and I'm still in therapy trying to process the level of betrayal from the 2 people I trusted most in the world. My best friend Jessica and I had been close since college, and my husband Tom and I had been married for 3 years. I thought I had the perfect life until everything exploded in the worst possible way. Jessica and I met during our sophomore year and became inseparable almost immediately. We were roommates for 2 years, stood in each other's weddings, and talked every single day. She was like a sister to me, and I considered her family. When Tom and I got married, Jessica was my maid of honor and gave this beautiful speech about how happy she was to see me with someone who loved me so completely. Tom had always gotten along well with Jessica, which I loved because it's important to me that my husband and best friend like each other. The 3 of us would hang out together all the time, go on double dates when Jessica was seeing someone, and she'd come over for dinner at least twice a week. She had a key to our house and treated it like her second home. After Jessica went through a bad breakup about 8 months ago, she started coming around even more often. She'd show up unannounced when she was feeling lonely or needed someone to talk to. Tom and I both felt bad for her and wanted to be supportive during a difficult time. She'd sometimes sleep on our couch when she'd been drinking and didn't want to drive home. I work as a nurse and have to pull 12-hour shifts at the hospital, including some overnight rotations. Tom works from home as a software developer, so he has a flexible schedule. Jessica knew my work schedule better than anyone because we'd coordinate our hangouts around when I was free. About 3 months ago, I started noticing that Jessica seemed different around Tom. She'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, find excuses to touch his arm when they were talking, and would dress up more when she knew she'd be seeing him. I brushed it off as her just trying to feel attractive again after her breakup. Tom started acting differently too, but in subtle ways that I didn't really think about at the time. He'd mention things Jessica had said or done when I wasn't around, like they'd had conversations I didn't know about. He'd seem more interested in her dating life and would ask if she was seeing anyone new. Jessica also started asking a lot of questions about Tom's work schedule and when he'd be home alone. She'd phrase it like she was trying to coordinate when to come over so she wouldn't interrupt his meetings. But looking back, it feels like she was gathering intelligence. The first real red flag should have been when I came home from a particularly brutal shift and found Jessica and Tom on the couch watching a movie. They were sitting closer together than usual, and Jessica jumped up really quickly when she heard me come in. Tom seemed flustered and immediately started asking about my day in this overly animated way. Jessica said she'd come over because she was bored, and Tom had suggested they watch something while waiting for me to get home. It seemed innocent enough, but there was this weird energy in the room that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jessica left shortly after I arrived, which was unusual because she normally would stay and hang out with both of us. A few weeks later, I had to work a double shift that would keep me at the hospital for almost 20 hours. Tom knew I'd be exhausted when I got home and probably wouldn't want to do anything except sleep. I texted Jessica that morning complaining about the long day ahead, and she was sympathetic and supportive like always. When I got home the next evening, something felt off immediately. The house was too clean, like someone had been frantically tidying up. Our bed was made, which was weird, because Tom never makes the bed during the day. There were 2 wine glasses in the dishwasher, but Tom told me he'd just had 1 glass while working and must have accidentally put 2 glasses in there. I found one of Jessica's earrings on the floor next to our dresser. When I asked Tom about it, he said Jessica had stopped by briefly to drop off a book she'd borrowed and must have lost it then. He seemed nervous when he was explaining, but I was too tired to think much about it. Over the next month, I kept finding little signs that Jessica had been in our house when I wasn't there. A lipstick that wasn't mine in the bathroom, the shower head adjusted to a different height, groceries we hadn't bought in our refrigerator. Every time I asked Tom about these things, he had reasonable explanations that I wanted to believe. Jessica's behavior was getting stranger too. She'd call or text me right after I left for work, supposedly to wish me luck with my shift. But then she'd go hours without responding to my messages during the day, which wasn't like her at all. She'd always been the type to text back immediately. She also started canceling plans with me more often, always with last-minute excuses about not feeling well or having work obligations. But then I'd see her posting on social media that she was out at bars or restaurants, clearly feeling fine and not working. The final straw came when I had to work an overnight shift that started at 7 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. I told both Tom and Jessica about this schedule days in advance. Jessica had even said she might come over and keep Tom company since he'd be home alone all night. I was having a particularly stressful night at work and decided to come home during my break around 2 a.m. to grab a quick shower and change of clothes. I figured Tom would be asleep and I could just slip in and out without disturbing him. When I pulled into our driveway, I saw Jessica's car parked on the street. I thought maybe she'd stayed late watching movies with Tom and fallen asleep on the couch again. I was actually happy that Tom had company during the long night. I used my key to come in quietly through the front door. The living room was empty, but there were 2 wine glasses on the coffee table and Jessica's purse on the side table. I could hear voices coming from upstairs, which struck me as odd since that's where our bedroom is. I went upstairs and stopped outside our bedroom door when I realized what I was hearing. Tom and Jessica were having sex in my bed. I could hear them talking and laughing between sounds that made me want to vomit. Jessica was saying things like, "I've wanted this for so long." And Tom was responding with things that made it clear this wasn't their first time together. I stood in that hallway for probably 5 minutes, listening to my husband and best friend destroy my entire world. I was in complete shock and couldn't process what was happening. Part of me wanted to burst in and confront them, but I was frozen. Finally, I went back downstairs and sat in my car, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go back to work in this state, but I also couldn't face going into that house and dealing with the confrontation. I called in sick and spent the rest of the night driving around aimlessly. I came home around 8 a.m. when I knew Jessica would be gone. Tom was in the kitchen making coffee like it was any other morning. He seemed surprised to see me and asked why I was home early. I told him I'd gotten sick and left work. He was being extra attentive and sweet, asking if he could make me breakfast or if I needed anything. Looking at him act so caring while knowing what he'd been doing a few hours earlier made me feel physically ill. I went upstairs to try to get some sleep, but I couldn't even look at our bed. The sheets had been changed and the room had been cleaned, but I could still smell Jessica's perfume. I ended up sleeping on the couch in the guest room. For the next few days, I didn't know how to handle the situation. I was devastated and furious, but I also kept questioning whether I'd really seen and heard what I thought I had. Both Tom and Jessica were acting completely normal around me, which made me feel like I was going insane. Jessica came over for dinner that weekend like nothing had happened. She hugged me, hello, and asked about work, and seemed perfectly comfortable sitting at my kitchen table. Tom was acting normal too, joking around and being affectionate with me in front of her. I couldn't take the pretending anymore. After Jessica left that night, I confronted Tom directly. I told him I'd come home during my break and knew what had happened between them. I expected him to deny it or try to lie his way out of it, but instead he just broke down. He admitted that he and Jessica had been sleeping together for over 2 months. It had started the night I found them watching movies on the couch. Jessica had been flirting with him for weeks, and that night she'd made a move that he didn't resist. He said it had happened several more times, always when I was working long shifts. They'd been planning their meetings around my schedule, and Jessica had been using her key to come over when she knew I'd be gone for extended periods. The worst part was when he told me they'd been doing it in our bed, because Jessica had said she wanted to see what it was like to be with him in the same place where he was with me. It was like she wanted to claim that space and make it about their relationship instead of ours. Tom kept apologizing and saying it had been the biggest mistake of his life. He claimed he'd tried to end it multiple times, but Jessica would guilt him into continuing. He said she'd threatened to tell me about the affair if he stopped seeing her, so he felt trapped. I asked him why he hadn't just told me himself if he felt so trapped, and he said he was terrified of losing me and thought he could figure out a way to end things with Jessica without me ever finding out. He swore that he loved me and that the thing with Jessica was just physical and didn't mean anything. But the betrayal felt too massive to forgive. It wasn't just that he cheated, it was that he'd done it with my best friend, in my own home, in my own bed. Every time I'd come home exhausted from trying to save people's lives, they'd been planning when they could be together next. I confronted Jessica the next day, and she had a completely different story. She said Tom had been pursuing her for months, and that she'd initially resisted because of our friendship. She claimed he'd told her that our marriage was struggling, and that he was planning to leave me anyway. She said she'd tried to end their relationship multiple times, but Tom had convinced her that they were meant to be together, and that eventually he'd divorce me so they could be open about their feelings. She painted herself as the victim who'd been manipulated by my husband. The two stories didn't match up at all, and I realized I couldn't trust either of them to tell me the truth about what had really happened. All I knew for certain was that the two people I loved most had been lying to my face for months while betraying me in the most intimate way possible. I asked Tom to move out that day and filed for divorce the following week. I blocked Jessica on everything and told her I never wanted to see her again. She tried calling and texting from different numbers, saying she wanted to explain and that she was sorry things had gotten so complicated. The mutual friends we shared were shocked when they found out what had happened. Most of them took my side, but a few seemed to think I should try to work things out with Tom since he was apologetic and wanted to save our marriage. Jessica tried to reach out through mutual friends, claiming that she missed our friendship and that she'd made a terrible mistake. She said she was willing to never see Tom again if I'd consider forgiving her and rebuilding our relationship. But I couldn't get past the fact that she'd used her key to my house to sleep with my husband in my bed. The violation was so complete and intentional that I couldn't imagine ever trusting her again. She'd taken everything that felt safe and sacred to me and destroyed it for her own selfish desires. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago, and I'm slowly rebuilding my life. Tom and Jessica are still together, which tells me everything I need to know about whether their relationship was really just physical or meaningless, like he claimed. This story is just crazy. Using her key to sleep with her best friend's husband in their marital bed is such a calculated betrayal I can barely comprehend it. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was months of deliberate deception and violation. Both Tom and Jessica are absolutely despicable. The fact that they coordinated around her work schedule shows this was premeditated manipulation, not some accident that got out of hand. Jessica especially is a backstabbing snake who destroyed her best friend's marriage and home for her own selfish desires. She's completely right to cut them both out of her life permanently. Real friends don't betray you this deeply, and real husbands don't conspire against you with people you trust. Let's move on to the next story here. And this one's called, "My Mother-in-Law Took My Newborn's First Photos and Posted Them Before I Even Saw Them." This happened 3 months ago, and I'm still furious about how my mother-in-law completely violated one of the most important moments of my life. My husband Jake and I had our first baby, a daughter we named Emma, after a difficult labor that ended in an emergency C-section. What should have been the happiest day of our lives turned into a nightmare because of his mother's entitled behavior. Jake's mom, Linda, has always been boundary pushy, but she got 10 times worse when she found out I was pregnant. She'd make comments about how she couldn't wait to be a grandmother again, and how she hoped this baby would be closer to her than Jake's sister's kids who live across the country. She'd constantly give unsolicited advice about everything from what I should eat to how I should prepare the nursery. During my pregnancy, Linda kept making comments about wanting to be in the delivery room when the baby was born. I politely told her that Jake and I wanted it to just be us for the actual birth, but that she could visit as soon as we were ready for visitors. She seemed disappointed but said she understood that it was our decision. As my due date approached, Linda started calling and texting more frequently, asking about any signs of labor. She'd call Jake multiple times a day, asking if I was having contractions or if my water had broken. When I went into labor at 38 weeks, Jake called his parents to let them know we were heading to the hospital. The labor was long and difficult, lasting over 20 hours before the doctors decided I needed an emergency C-section. I was exhausted and scared, but all I could think about was finally meeting our daughter. Jake was amazing throughout the whole process and stayed by my side the entire time. After Emma was born, I was still pretty out of it from the anesthesia and the exhaustion of labor. The nurses brought her to me for skin-to-skin contact, but I was so drowsy that I could barely focus. Jake was crying, happy tears, and taking photos of Emma and me together, but I was mostly just trying to stay awake. I told Jake I needed to rest and asked him to take Emma to the nursery so I could sleep for a few hours. I was looking forward to having more alert time with her once I recovered from the surgery. Jake said his parents were in the waiting room and asked if it was okay for them to meet Emma briefly before she went to the nursery. I was too tired to really think about it, so I just nodded yes. I assumed they'd peek at her for a minute and then let me rest. Jake kissed me and said he'd be back soon, then left with Emma to introduce her to his parents. I fell asleep almost immediately and didn't wake up until about 4 hours later. When I woke up, Jake wasn't in the room, and Emma wasn't in the little bassinet next to my bed. I pressed the call button to ask the nurse where my baby was, and she said my husband and his family were still in the family lounge with her. I was confused because I thought they were just going to meet her quickly. I asked Jake to bring Emma back because I was feeling much better and wanted to spend time with her. He said they'd be back in a few minutes, that his mom was just finishing taking some photos. When they finally came back to my room about an hour later, Linda was carrying Emma and acting like she was her own baby. She was cooing at her and calling her my little princess and seemed reluctant to hand her over to me. When I reached for Emma, Linda said, "Just a few more minutes," and continued holding her. I was getting frustrated and told Linda I wanted to hold my daughter. She finally gave Emma to me but seemed annoyed about it. She immediately started telling me how alert and beautiful Emma was and how she'd been awake the whole time they were with her in the lounge. That's when I realized I'd missed Emma's first alert period after birth because Linda had monopolized that time. I felt like I'd been robbed of those precious first moments when my daughter was awake and looking around. Instead of bonding with her mother, Emma had spent that time being passed around by her grandmother and extended family. Linda kept talking about all the photos she'd taken and how she couldn't wait to show them to everyone. She pulled out her phone and started showing me pictures of Emma that I'd never seen before. There were dozens of photos of Linda holding Emma, Jake's dad holding Emma, and various family members posing with my newborn daughter. I asked Linda to send me the photos, and she said she would, but then she started talking about how she wanted to post some of them on social media to announce Emma's arrival to all her friends. I told her I'd prefer if she waited until Jake and I had a chance to make our own announcement first. She seemed annoyed by this request and said she'd already told all her friends about Emma being born and they were expecting to see photos. She said it seemed silly to make people wait when she had such beautiful pictures to share. I was too exhausted to argue, so I just asked her to please wait until the next day. After Linda and Jake's dad left that evening, I asked Jake to make sure his mom understood that we wanted to be the first ones to post about Emma on social media. He said he'd talk to her about it and that she understood our wishes. I felt better knowing that Jake had reinforced the boundary I'd tried to set. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of notifications on my phone. Linda had posted a full album of photos on Facebook announcing Emma's birth, including close-up shots of Emma's face, photos of her holding Emma, and even some pictures of me looking completely out of it right after the C-section. I was mortified and furious. Not only had she ignored my request to wait, but she'd posted photos of me at my most vulnerable moment without my permission. The worst part was that these photos of Emma were the first ones most of our friends and family were seeing, and they weren't even taken by her parents. I called Jake immediately, and he was just as shocked as I was. He said he'd specifically asked his mother to wait and that he couldn't believe she'd gone ahead and posted everything anyway. He called Linda right away to ask her to take the posts down. Linda's response was that she was just so excited to share the good news and that she didn't think it was a big deal. She said the photos were beautiful and that everyone was commenting about how gorgeous Emma was. She acted like she'd done us a favor by announcing Emma's arrival to the world. When Jake insisted that she remove the posts, Linda got defensive and said she was Emma's grandmother and had every right to share photos of her grandchild. She said we were being unreasonable and selfish by trying to control how she celebrated Emma's birth. The argument escalated when Linda refused to take down the posts. She said too many people had already seen them and that it would be embarrassing for her to remove them now. She claimed we should be grateful that she'd taken such nice photos and that we were being ungrateful by complaining about her sharing them. Jake was getting angrier by the minute and told his mother that she'd completely overstepped and violated our privacy. He said the fact that she'd posted photos of me recovering from surgery without my permission was completely unacceptable. Linda started crying and saying we were being cruel to her when she was just trying to help and celebrate. The conversation ended with Linda hanging up on Jake and refusing to remove the posts. She left them up for 2 more days before finally taking them down, but by then, hundreds of people had seen them and shared them. Our own announcement felt pointless because everyone had already seen Linda's version of Emma's arrival. What made it worse was that Linda had written captions on the photos, like "My beautiful granddaughter Emma," and "so blessed to meet this little angel," as if she was the primary person in Emma's life. She'd positioned herself as the star of Emma's birth story, instead of letting Jake and me share our own experience. In the days that followed, Linda acted like nothing had happened. She'd call to check on Emma and me, send gifts, and want to visit as if she hadn't completely violated our boundaries around one of the most important moments of our lives. When I tried to explain how hurt I was, she'd dismiss my feelings and say I was being too sensitive. She started telling people that I was being difficult and controlling about Emma, and that she was just trying to be a loving grandmother. She painted herself as the victim who was being kept away from her grandchild by an unreasonable daughter-in-law. The situation came to a head 2 weeks later when Linda showed up at our house unannounced with a professional photographer. She said she'd booked a newborn photo session as a gift and wanted to get some nice family portraits with Emma. She'd made all these arrangements without consulting us and expected us to just go along with her plan. I told Linda that we weren't comfortable with a photo session and that she needed to stop making decisions about Emma without asking us first. She got upset and said she was just trying to create beautiful memories for our family and that I was being unreasonable by rejecting her generous gift. Jake finally stepped in and told his mother that her behavior since Emma's birth had been completely inappropriate. He said she'd violated our privacy, ignored our boundaries, and made Emma's arrival about herself instead of respecting our wishes as parents. Linda started crying and saying that we were keeping her from being a grandmother and that she'd only wanted to help and be involved. She claimed we were being cruel and that she didn't understand why we couldn't just appreciate everything she was trying to do for us. Jake told her that being a grandmother didn't give her the right to make decisions about Emma or post photos without our permission. He said until she could respect our boundaries and apologize for her behavior, she wouldn't be spending time with Emma unsupervised. Linda left that day and didn't speak to us for 3 weeks. She finally called to apologize, but it was one of those non-apologies where she said she was sorry if we felt hurt by her actions. She didn't acknowledge that what she'd done was wrong, just that our feelings had somehow been hurt by her well-intentioned behavior. We decided to give her another chance, but with strict boundaries about photos and social media. We told her she could take pictures when she visited, but she couldn't post anything without our explicit permission. She agreed to these terms, but I could tell she thought we were being ridiculous. The relationship is still strained 3 months later. Linda follows the rules about photos now, but she clearly resents having to ask permission. She makes passive-aggressive comments about how different things were when she was raising her children, and how she doesn't understand why everything has to be so complicated now. I'm still angry about missing Emma's first alert moments, and about having her birth announcement hijacked. Those are moments I can never get back, and photos that will always exist, showing Linda as the central figure in Emma's first day of life instead of me and Jake. The whole experience taught me that I need to be much more assertive about boundaries with Linda from the beginning. I was too tired and vulnerable after giving birth to properly advocate for myself, and she took complete advantage of that situation. This situation is absolutely infuriating. Linda completely steamrolled over basic parental boundaries during one of the most vulnerable and important moments in their lives. taking and posting a newborn's first photos without permission is such an entitled violation of privacy. The fact that she monopolized the baby's first alert period means this new mom missed irreplaceable bonding time that she can never get back. Linda made Emma's birth about herself instead of respecting the actual parents' wishes, then had the audacity to play victim when called out. New parents have every right to control their baby's first photos and announcements. Standing up to boundary-stomping in-laws is crucial, especially when they exploit vulnerable moments like postpartum recovery.